Hello and welcome to my channel. This video is going to be a little bit different to the ones I usually do because I'm actually going to be making a musical instrument for the first time ever and also showing you what it sounds like towards the end. So make sure you stick around to the end of the video because this thing sounds like nothing else you've ever heard of. What instrument am I making? Well, I'm going to be making a nail violin. What is a nail violin, you ask? Well, it's an instrument that was invented around 1740 by the German violinist Johann Wilde, and when he was hanging up his violin bow on a coat peg, he noticed that it made a musical sound when he drew the bow across it. And that gave him the idea, I wonder if we could make a musical instrument out of that. So he then proceeded to do some prototypes and produced the first nail violin, which is basically a set of brass rods or metal rods hammered into a semicircular piece of wood, which produce a musical note, and they get smaller and smaller to produce high notes. I'm going to put some pictures here of some historical nail violins. And it was quite popular for around about 100 years, so up until about 1850. There's quite a lot of examples in museums of different designs, different types of nail violins. Most of them were semicircular, some of them were entirely circular, some of them even had sympathetic strings on the top like this one. All of them worked with the same principle of a series of metal rods which get smaller as the pitch gets higher and are played with a violin bow and a resonating box below. There were some later attempts to make developed kinds of nail violins that had slightly different designs, but it never became really popular. So it was really kind of the early 19th century, which is probably when it was at its height. It was probably more designed for amateur players. There was only one professional player that we know of who was active around the late 18th century, and there's only one surviving piece of music for it, which is actually very difficult to play, so presumably they just played popular songs and other pieces of music of that era. It got me very curious when I was researching this. What does a nail violin sound like? I couldn't find really any examples of a modern made nail violin or even anyone playing an old one to see what it sounded like. So that's what spurred me on to make my own. So I thought, well, how difficult can it be? It's basically a box with some metal rods hammered into it. Let's have a go at making one. Here we are in my pretty disorganised garage. I'm going to talk you through some of the materials that I chose to use to make my nail violin and where I'm up to so far with the construction of it. So I wanted to use cheap and easily available material. So the first thing I did was bought a sheet of plywood. This is 3.6mm plywood. Now the reason I chose this is because it's the thinnest sheet material I could find, and I know that for the soundboard of a musical instrument it's better to have it thinner so it can vibrate more. The soundboards of lutes, for example, are incredibly thin. It's probably better to have used some kind of softwood, spruce or something like that you use for guitars or lute tops. This is the only thing I could find that was easily available here. This is hardwood plywood, which is in hindsight probably not the best material to use, but I had to go with it in the end. I also bought some rods, metal rods, which I was going to use for the actual nails. So I brought some brass rods. These are 4mm thickness, and also some steel ones of 4mm as well, just to see what the difference was. First thing I did was mark out the overall shape of the instrument. So the historical nail violins all seem to be semicircular or sometimes entirely circular, but mostly semicircular. So I went with that, so that obviously the nails would then be around the outside of the instrument so you can get the bow around it quite easily. This presented a bit of a challenge in having to bend the wood to make the side, which ended up being quite actually difficult to do. So I drew that out, made a little tool to draw out the circle. I actually then made a mould, because I, as you do, went on YouTube and looked up how to bend plywood, and there seemed to be various different ways of doing it, but recommended to make a mould, which I made like this to bend it. This ended up being entirely useless, as it didn't really work out like that. So I tried to cut the wood to the side. I did quite a few goes at this, and I tried wetting it. I tried going along the grain and tried going across the grain, and every time I tried to bend it, it would get to a certain point, and then even doing it very gradually, and then that happens and it cracks. So another technique I looked up was something called kerf bending, where you cut lots of little grooves, I don't know if you can see those, into the wood, and this will enable it to bend. Now I tried that, and I tried bending it this way, and again the same thing happened. You can see there it cracked along the weak point there. What I did find though, that if you wet it and do it very gradually, it will allow you to bend it the other way. So normally you would bend it this way so you get the flat face of wood outside, but I thought actually maybe I could go with that as a kind of design feature, maybe put something a little bit like lute ribs almost, maybe make that kind of a decorative thing, and that was the only way I could do it actually in the end, was to bend it that way. Because this technique weakens the wood quite a lot, I was going to originally laminate it out of various pieces and put it in the mould. I decided to do it in a different way, so I took a bit of old flooring, a bit of chipboard there, which is quite strong and it's got no grain in, so it's not weak in any particular direction. And then I cut out the shape of the semicircle, and I made 2 hoops, which are here, by cutting it on the inside and the outside, which would be the form, and then a kind of, I don't know if you can see that, structure on the inside there to hold that all together, and then glued the back on. Then I was able to bend my plywood that was cut in that way, with the grooves, with the curve bending, and I wet it and did it very gradually and bent it on and glued that on. I found that in order to keep it to the shape, it needed some small nails along at different points just to keep it tight to the frame, but I'm going to disguise those later, I think, by trying to put something in those grooves, just for a decorative effect. I've been doing some experiments with the technique of how the nail violin is played. So I've got 2 rods here that I've nailed into this little piece of wood. So this one is a 3mm actual nail with the head cut off, and this one is one of the steel rods I've bought, and I've got a cheap violin bow here. I'm just going to rest it on this here just to resonate slightly, so let's see what happens if I try and bow them. So I'm definitely getting a note off that one. And everything I've read about the nail violin is that it works a lot better if you bow very close to the top of the nail or the rod. So let's try that. Yeah, that's true. It does seem to speak a little easier at the top. Let's try different. That speaks quite easily. Let's try the other one. Now this seems to be much more difficult to get a note out of it. Yeah, that doesn't want to. It does produce a note, but it's not very clear and it's a bit strange. That is okay, I suppose. You have to work quite hard. So the other thing I was interested in finding out is what difference the thickness of the rod meant, because I thought it would be like a lute or a guitar string, that the thicker it is, the deeper the pitch is, but it seems to make a slight difference. It's 3mm and 4mm. So when I can get a good note out of it, it seems to be pretty much the same note because they are the same length, and obviously the longer they are, the deeper the pitch is, and the shorter they are, the higher the pitch is. But the actual thickness of the rod doesn't seem to make much difference. But what I have learnt is that a 3mm rod seems to vibrate better than 4mm, so I might have to change and get some 3mm rods instead. Quick update, so I've finished the soundboard now and cut out the sound hole. Most of the original 18th century nail violins seem to have a rose rather than an open sound hole, like a lute. So they are either carved into the top of the soundboard itself, or as a separate insert which is put in. So I'm planning to do that with mine to make it look a bit more authentic and a bit nicer. That means that you need some strengthening bars behind, because the rose is very, very thin and fragile at certain points. I found a nice rose on the internet which I've ordered. It's quite a bit thicker than the actual thickness of the soundboard, so I've had to recess the strengthening bars a little bit just to compensate for that, so that's all ready. I've also finished the main frame of the instrument, so glued the back on and the sides, so that's all ready for the top to go on. main body of the instrument now is complete. One of the main issues I've had all the way through this project is the use of plywood, which in hindsight was a mistake. The problem with plywood is, of this grade anyway, is that the top layer, which is the nicest looking wood, is very, very thin. It's almost like a piece of paper. And when you cut it, particularly when you cut across the grain, which I had to do all the way along with the semicircle, is it kind of frays and chips and looks awful, really. So the only way I could find to tidy it up was to cut round the semicircle with a very sharp knife, and then remove the top layer of veneer around the edge and then paint that gold, which I think looks okay in the end. I also added this binding, which is meant to be like fake ivory, I think, which is the kind of thing you'll get on the sides of a fingerboard of an electric guitar. I ended up sanding off the top layer of veneer of the plywood on the edges of the instrument and also the back. It actually looks better like that. In fact, maybe I should have done the top like that as well, but I just stained it and it's ended up like a slightly different colour to the top, which is, and a different kind of grain, which looks nice as well. The bars, strengthening bars for the rosette, which is on its way, are in, so I can just drop that in when that's finished. I've also drilled all the holes for the rods, which was quite a complicated process, so I did a template for it. They go from thicker diameter rods, from 4mm, and then down to 3, and then end up as 2mm at the end, because as they get shorter, that they vibrate better if they're thinner. But if you have a longer rod and it's too thin, it just wobbles around and you can't really get the bow onto it, so they have to kind of go down in a gradation from thicker to thinner as it goes along. But they're all drilled now, so the next stage is to actually install the rods and try and get them in tune. So finally the nail violin is now actually finished. As you can see, I decided to paint the rose gold. I think that works well and it matches with quite a few 18th century instruments. I also added a bit of edging around the sound hole of this material, which is meant to be faux ivory, I think. It's the same that I use for binding around the edges of the main part of the instrument. I also have added this guide rail here. Most historical nail violins had this, and having played it before I added it and after, it does make it a lot easier to play, because what it does is it holds the bow in position. So when you move the bow around, it holds it at the top of the rod. So the best sound is produced by bowing right at the top, and this holds it in position. What I found is before I added this, is the bow often got caught on the top of the rods, which made it more difficult to play. It was very, very difficult to actually make this guide rail because it has to stay a very, very small distance away from the actual rods, but it also has to compensate for the height of them and follow that along the way. So bending that was really quite difficult, but managed it in the end. I've also fitted all the chromatic rods here, which are all bent back slightly. Again, the reason they're bent back is so that when you play the main note, you don't hit the chromatic note, which means it is a little bit more difficult to get a note out of these ones because of the position of them, and that you have to kind of bow it a little bit further down, but that's the way the instrument works. It's just a case of learning it. I've experimented with different bows. What I found is this is a small size cello bow, and I found just because it's a little bit thicker and a bit wider, it seems to work a little bit better. So it seems to be the more friction you can get on the rods, the clearer the sound is, and also the more rosin. So I had to put an awful lot of rosin on, and that seems to get them working better. It does warm up after a little while as well, so the more you play them, the more kind of it responds. But overall, I'm fairly happy with it. I had some problems with the varnishing of the top as well, because I kept getting dust and little particles in it, which was very annoying, and I had to re-varnish it a few times even when the rods were already fitted, so that was a little bit annoying, but it's probably as good as it's going to be now. Tuning it has proved quite difficult, and I've had to retune it several times now. Every time you change something or add something, it seems to go out of tune. So the pitch of the notes is literally how long the rods are, or how thick they are as well. So if the notes are too flat, then you have to hammer it in slightly further, but it's very, very sensitive. Particularly the smaller they get, the less tolerance there is. And if it's too sharp, then you have to just pull them out slightly with some pliers and wiggle them. I used an electric tuner to make it easier, but it is quite difficult to tune. But it does seem to stay in tune once it's in tune. I've been having some fun learning how to play it. Unfortunately, there's not really any transferable skills I can use. As a lutenist, the right hand is plucking, the left hand is fretting notes. Neither of those skills are any use whatsoever on the nail violin. It's entirely really right hand bow technique, which I don't really have any of. So I've managed to get a tune out of it, but I think it would take quite a while to learn to play it properly. And when you've got big jumps as well, it's quite difficult to hit the right rod. It's a lot easier to play notes that are next to each other, and the chromatic ones are a little bit challenging as well. It does sound like nothing else I can think of. It's a very unique sound, quite ethereal, quite a beautiful sound, although the technique of it is quite difficult to learn in a short period of time, mainly because I don't have the bow skills, as I say. Maybe a violinist would get on better, although it's probably still quite different from a real violin. I have managed to play a short piece on it though, which I recorded. Tried to use the full range of notes as well so you can hear what it sounds like across the range. So this is In the Bleak Midwinter with nail violin and mandora accompaniment. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. Plenty of other interesting instruments on here, weird and wonderful stuff on there. So please have a check out of my other videos, and I'll see you on the next one.